What is up, everybody? I am Steve SBU coming at you guys with a Draft League tier list. This week I am ranking all of the types from almost never useful, niche, sometimes useful, often useful, and every team needs one of these types. I am deciding to rank it on these factors because in all cases, you're never really going to, depending on the matchup, you may end up needing a D tier type, or a move might make it slightly decent in some cases, but there has to be a bottom tier at some point. And S tier, being every team needs one, means that if you are not drafting at least one of these types, it is not a good team, in my opinion. But let's get right started with the D tier. This tier, I feel like, is only going to have one type, and it is going to be the objectively worst type. Well, objectively, subjectively worst type. And that type, I would say, is the rock type. I think the rock type is the single worst type in Pokemon. And that is mainly because it is supposed to be a defensive type, but has so many weaknesses. And not only weaknesses, but has weaknesses to some of the best types in the game, as you will see later on. So not only are you bringing a type with so many weaknesses, but you're bringing a type that has so many weaknesses that are so good to bring in almost every single matchup. Yes, I would say that Stealth Rocks makes Rock not an awful type. However, Stealth Rocks can be used by several other different types as well, so I wouldn't even really consider this to be a massive buff. And most Rock stab moves are not that good. Like, yeah, there are some standout rock types, like Mega Diancie, but, like, in all honesty, it is not that good of a typing, and if anything, it's more of a hindrance to the Pokemon more than anything. And then next up, the next type I would say is the normal type. And the reason I would say that is, while yes, it is not an awful type, resisting nothing is not very good. So defensive wise, it is not great. Yes, you have the ghost immunity, but in turn ghost is immune to you, so it's not as good. Normal can be good. Like, that's why I'm saying it's niche, and on certain Pokemon it can be great. Just speaking from my experience on Ursaluna, it is an amazing typing because it allows it to hit most things neutrally, and its other stab move, Ground, is able to hit those resistances for super effective damage. So it balances each other out because of the dual typing. But overall, I would say normal is a fairly mid tier. Like, you would not want to draft a normal type if you don't have one of the other top tier types yet. And if you end up getting a normal type later on, you're not really going to complain about it, but that is sort of the mind space there. Next up, we have the ice type. Most people would say ice type is D tier. However, I personally am a believer that the ice typing got a massive buff this generation, with Snow giving the ice type defense boost, as well as not doing any chip damage to your fellow teammates. So that makes running Hail teams, or not Hail teams, Snow teams, way more viable than they were previously. And you have some really solid setup Pokemon for Hail, such as Abomasnow getting a defense boost, making it way more bulky than it was initially, as well as Alola Tails being able to set Aurora Veil, which is amazing for it, and even the non-ice type in Galarian Slowking with Chilly Reception being able to set up Snow and then switch out right away into your ice type sweeper. It makes running Hail teams way more viable, and thus making the ice type more viable, as you're almost always using your ice type as an offensive menace rather than a defensive typing. I feel like defensive ice types do not work because they have so many weaknesses and only one resistance, being themselves, so their secondary typing really has to make up for it. And in a lot of cases with defensive Pokemon, ice just has way too many weaknesses to be able to consider it. However, offensively, it is amazing. With the Bolt Beam coverage of Thunderbolt, it can hit every type for at least neutral damage. And that's mainly what it needs. It needs a lot of neutral, strong attacks, and being able to set up Aurora Veil as well allows you to be able to take things more defensively while you are setting up your offense. And then next up, I would put the Grass type up here. Grass is a good defensive typing, but you are almost never using it for offense. There are a few cases in which, yes, you can use it for offense, such as if you are running in a tier with like Shaman Sky, for example, but you're almost always using your Grass type as a defensive Pokemon. Like, for me, example, with Celebi, being able to set up Leech Seed and having 100 base stats across the board, I run Bulk a lot of the time. Yes, I do offense as well a little bit with it. However, I almost always use it as a defensive backbone for my team. And I feel like that's where it's best suited for. It's best used as a defensive Pokemon, and usually you can get away with running a low tier Grass type for that defensive purpose. Like in another league I was in that is not recorded on this channel, I was running Meganium, and it actually took things fairly well. I was able to set up screens, set up Leech Seed, and then just chip things with Giga Drain, and that's all I really needed it for. So a lot of the times you can get away with not picking a top tier Grass type and just getting a low tier Grass type. However, if you really are struggling for a secondary typing, or if all of the good low tier grasses have already been picked, then occasionally a higher tier Grass type, you're not going to complain about it. But I would say that the Grass typing in general is a lot more niche, and you're using your Grass type defensively, and if you are using it offensively, it's because of its secondary typing. And the next up at the top of C tier, I would put the Bug type. And that is mainly because the prevalence of U-turn and stab U-turn is really, really nice. And being able to hit Psychics pretty super effectively is nice, as well as Dark types. Just an overall good offensive type. Defensively, it's not great. And offensively, yes, it does fall short in a lot of cases. However, just 3 Pokemon that I am initially thinking of being Scizor, Kleavor, as well as Forretress. Those are Pokemon that a lot of people, well, maybe not a lot, but a good amount of people end up picking. Kleavor is very strong offensively, just to spam like Choice Band or Choice Scarf U-turns all over the place. Set up Stealth Rock, and Scizor just being a very solid offensive Pokemon, as well as defensively as well. If you are running Megas in draft as well, Mega Scizor is almost always one of the first mons to go for the Megas, because it can do so much defensively as well as offensively. And then Forretress, it is the main like defensive bug type. Forretress, I would say, is fairly overrated. It is not that defensive, especially considering that it just dies in one fire hit, which with Scizor, you can pivot it a lot easier, but with a defensive type, you really don't like to have that 4 times weakness, especially since, like, if you're trying to spin away your hazards, your opponent's hazards, and he switches into a fire type, well, now you can't do that. So that's kind of tough there, as well as being able to set up rocks and spikes. It's nice, but you're mostly using it as a suicide lead more than anything. And then next up, moving up to B tier, I would put the Psychic type. And that is mainly because offensively it is fairly good, but it's nothing standout. It is solid overall, but it's not a huge standout. There are some Psychic types who are big standouts, such as Galarian Slowking being my favorite draft Pokemon. The Psychic type is really useful in a lot of cases, but if you've noticed, I have almost never used a Psychic type with it. I have almost always ran the Poison typing alongside a coverage move, and then Chilly Reception, and then possibly Thunder Wave or a third coverage move. And that is mainly because the Psychic typing, just a lot of good typings resist or are immune to it. So it is, and it doesn't hit that many great types for super effective damage. So while yes, you can do it, you can bring it fairly easily, it is not a standout typing, which is why it lands in the B tier. And then next up, this may be a little controversial, but I would put the Fire type here as well. And that is mainly because offensively, great. great offensive typing, I would say. Not being able to be burned is excellent, and being able to possibly run Eruption if you are running like a Camerupt, Mega Camerupt, or a Typhlosion, or Hisuian Typhlosion. Eruption is just great, and offensively it can dish out a lot of damage, as well as hit some good types for super effective damage. I just feel like it falls a little short sometimes. Either it doesn't have enough power, or you are only using it for your offensive power, and then your opponent is just going to wall it with one of his like water types that he has, as an example. So while yes, the fire typing is nice to have, and it is definitely a good typing to pick up at least one of, unless you are running a sun team, you almost never want to really run multiple fire types on a team, personally, is what I would say. And then next up, at the top of B tier, I would put the fighting type. And that is mainly because the fighting type, it can hit a lot of types for super effective damage, a lot of which being these more low tier types as well, but it can hit some of the high tier types for super effective or neutral damage as well. I just feel like if it doesn't get close combat, then it's not as good. However, close combat has had a fairly widespread usage nowadays, which is great, but I just feel like, again, along with the fire type, you're using it for its offensive strength rather than for any defensive purpose, and the best defensive purpose I would say it has is resisting rock type. And that is simply because then you can switch it in on Stealth Rocks fairly often, and if it's a fighting type spinner, I can't think of any examples right off the top of my head, but if it can do that, Quaquaval, that's a good example. It can switch in on Stealth Rocks, spin them away, great. But that is just the biggest thing for me. If you're not using it for offense, then you're either trying to get a mix-up on the matchup, or it is a setup Pokemon, so you're running Bolt, and then you're going to be setting up your offenses anyway. And then next up, we have the Flying type. This might be a little bit controversial yet again, because the Flying typing is not the most amazing type in the world. However, once we get to S tier, I will explain one reason why the Flying type is a really good type just to have, as well as just a general type that can do some good damage as well. Being immune to a lot of entry hazards aside from rocks is very useful to have, and having a defogger is great. You can run heavy duty boots on your flying type almost every single week, defog away hazards. It's amazing to do, especially if you're not the type to set up your own hazards just yet and you just want to get rid of your opponent's hazards. That is the best way that you can do that. And then being able to be immune to some really solid types just really puts it ahead of everything else that has come so far, in my opinion. However, if you don't get Brave Bird, then you may not want to be running it offensively as much, or Hurricane, of course. And that is mainly because those are the most offensive flying type moves, and if your opponent doesn't get either, then it's not really that great. However, there are some cases with some Pokemon where not having that works just fine, such as Hawlucha. It doesn't get any, but since it has acrobatics, that synergizes very well with the Unburden ability, so that is one of those instances where that is not 100% true. And then next up, I would put the Ghost type. And the Ghost type, I don't think is S tier, but I feel like its usefulness, it just puts it out of B tier, as it makes it so that you cannot get spun on. Being able to spin block is a very, very useful thing to have, because if you're a very hazard stacking team with like Glamora or Hisuian Samurott or something along those lines, having a Ghost type to be able to stop your opponent from spinning is very, very useful, especially if you have Goldango or Annihilate. Those mons can block multiple forms of hazard removal, or at least deter most forms of hazard removal. Goldango is completely immune to hazard removal, whereas Annihilate, with its Defiant ability, makes it so that your opponent is very hesitant to click Defog, mainly because it can get that Defiant boost. The Ghost type does not have as much going for it offensively, however, I feel like it can do some decent offense as well, being the only things that really resist it are Dark, and it is Normal is immune to it, but that is just my general opinion. It is just a solid all-around type, but I don't think it is quite S tier. Next up, we have the Electric type. The Electric type, I would say, is way more useful in a Terra metagame, because your Electric type is almost always going to be your Terra Pokemon, because you're going to Terra into an Ice type, so you can get the Volt Beam coverage for it. However, in a Terra metagame, you could also do the same thing for Ice types, but Electric types are almost always going to be a little bit faster than the majority of Ice types, and being able to Terra out of a ground weakness can be nice in certain instances, as well as an Electric type possibly even Terraing into a Flying type to dodge any potential earthquakes coming its way. Overall, this is just a very strong offensive typing in general. Having only one weakness is really nice, but at the same time, that one weakness is also immune to it, so it is a little hit or miss, but that's why it is so much better in a Terra metagame. In a non-Terra metagame, it is not as essential. I would probably put it at a B tier. However, with a Terra, I would say it's almost S tier. So I am just going to compromise and leave it in the middle of A tier. Next up, we have the Poison typing. Poison is a very mid typing overall. However, I would say that there are certain instances that makes Poison so powerful that I would immediately move it from C or B tier, where it normally could be, all the way up to A tier. And that is simply because you can set Toxic Spikes with certain Pokemon and be able to absorb Toxic Spikes from another opponent if you are a grounded Poison type. And that means if your Poison typing does not have Levitate or the Flying typing and it is touching the ground, it can absorb the Toxic Spikes and get rid of them without using any form of hazard removal. It is so useful in a lot of different matchups, and your Poison typing being able to switch in a lot on offensive Pokemon, because usually you're almost going to be running walls with your Poison typing for that specific reason, to be able to get Toxics off on your opponent, as well as spamming Poison, which is actually a fairly good offensive typing, to be able to get poisons off on things and just generally be able to get good chip damage. And plus, a lot of Poison types, such as like Galarian Slowking or any form of Poison Dark types, they're just so useful in a lot of different cases that makes me put it in the high A tier, simply because almost every team wants a grounded Poison type just to be able to get rid of any Toxic Spikes should your opponent be able to bring them, just in case. And then finally, at the top of A tier, we have the Dark type. I am putting the Dark type in A tier mainly because, well, yes, almost every team should have a Dark type. Your team can get away with not having a Dark type, is basically what I'm thinking. And that is simply because Knockoff and Stab Knockoff, it is incredibly strong. Being able to block Prankster is really good, and Dark being able to hit a lot of really good types for super effective damage is really crucial, and only being resisted by, I believe, 2 types. It is crazy good offensively, and I would probably put it at one of the top 3 best offensive typings in the game. However, having a weakness to one of the best typings in the game does not make it quite into S tier, in my opinion. And I feel like if you have a bad matchup into this typing, then your team kind of gets bowled over, no matter how many good Dark types you have. And that's pretty much what I would say. That one single typing just keeps that entire type out of the S tier. personally. And then next up, we have the Dragon type in S tier. The reason I am putting it at low S is because the main reason you want your Dragon type is to spam Draco Meteor. That is your single reason to really bring it. Every other reason to bring it, it is just simply not as useful for that. And if your Dragon type does not get Draco Meteor, then it is not as good of a Dragon type. However, there are some cases where that is not 100% true. Like with Garchomp, you're using it for other purposes, not just for spamming Draco Meteor, as it is more of a physically offensive Dragon type, but then you're spamming Outrage or Earthquake, your other stab move, or you're getting hazards up with it, but that is just more so Garchomp rather than the Dragon typing as a whole. Dragon is just a very solid offensive type. It is only resisted / immune by 2 types in the entire game. Everything else, it hits for either super effective or neutral damage, and it does so much damage. Like, you need to have one of these 2 typings in order to just eat one of its hits. If your team does not have a resist to Dragon, it is not a good team. Because then your opponent can just simply bring like a Hydreigon with Choice Specs and Draco Meteor, and then your team just gets bowled over. Because it gets 1 hit off, its special attack gets lowered, it switches out, takes a hit, and then it comes back in later on, and then just drops another Draco on you, killing that Pokemon. You need one of these typings. And these 2 typings are made S tier because of their resistances and their ability to wall Dragon types. In my opinion, yes, it is similar to Dark type, but Dragon typing is just so much more spammable than Dark type is for that reason, in my opinion. And their good matchup into Dragon is what makes them good. Rather, with Dark type, that one type, it is good even aside from resisting Dark, if that makes sense. And then next up, we have the Ground typing. This is the reason why Flying is A tier, because Ground is such a good, spammable type. And not only that, but being able to get a lot of entry hazards up as well, because a lot of really good Ground types get most forms of entry hazards like Rocks. Again, you're going to be slapping Stealth Rock on your Ground type a lot of the time. Not every time, because yes, you could be running an offensive Ground type, but majority of the time, if you're running a defensive Ground type, it is going to be your Rocker or your Spiker. It is going to do great things for that, and it's just so good to spam ground moves everywhere, and you almost always need a Flying type if your team is really weak to ground, because having that 1 immunity is really solid for it. However, with some other typings that have that as a flaw, like the Electric type, it is almost always bringing like Rock type coverage to hit those Flying types. And Mons that can, like Ground type Mons that can hit Flying for super effective damage like Mamoswine, are really underrated and good Pokemon for that specific reason, that they beat their defensive checks with their other stab moves. So that is the main reason why I would put Ground at S tier. Almost every team needs a Ground type, and that's sort of the way that it's been for a very long time. If you have not heard that before, I would be very surprised. And then next up, I would put the Water type. These next 2 types could be flip-flopped here. I would put them fairly equally on either side of each other. But the Water type, everyone knows what a defensive Water type is. It can just, every hit, even super effective hits, these Water types can just tank everything. And then the things that resist Water typing offensively, they get hit really hard by Ice type, which is one of the main types that Waters bring for that specific reason. Almost every Water type brings Ice Beam as a coverage move, and everything that doesn't, they're bringing Freeze Dry. Like Iron Bundle is so good offensively because nothing that resists its Hydro Pump resists its Freeze Dry. It is just crazy busted in general that Water can hit so many things super effectively, like the Ground type, the Fire type, and with its Ice coverage, it can hit Grass, it can hit Flying, it can hit Ground again, it can hit Rock. it can hit so many different types offensively, and then being able to take so many hits in return makes it so incredibly busted. And then you add rain on top of that as a possible strategy, and you just got one of the best types in the entire game, honestly. And then for the runner-up, I would put the fairy type. The reason I would put this type just barely over water is because of its matchup against the dragon, mainly. Being able to have an immunity to dragon immediately makes it S tier. It is so crazy strong for that specific reason. And then not only that, but offensively, it has a good matchup into it, as well as a strong matchup into dark, and very few other types even resist it. Like, the only other type that resists it for the most part is poison and fire, and the number one type on this list. Fairy is just so strong to have overall, and being able to spam Moonblasts, being able to possibly, like, honestly, that's all you really need. You have Moonblast to hit any of your opposing typings, and defensively, it only has 2 weaknesses, and it has a lot of really solid resistances, like fighting and dark. It is really good to have on a defensive Pokemon for those resistances, even if Fairy itself is not the best defensive typing, and that is why the number 1 typing, Steel type, is here. Is because it resists Fairy, it works incredibly well with Fairy, making it one of the best dual typings in the entire game, being able to resist most other things such as Psychic, resist Dragon, it is immune to poison, and it cannot be poisoned as well. Like, Steel types are so good defensively because they cannot be poisoned and worn down by Toxic. And not only that, but being able to resist so many types just makes it so incredibly good. And then offensively, it checks Fairy, which is the only thing you really need the Steel type offensively for. The Steel type is what Rock wishes it was. I have no issue in saying that Steel is probably one of the single best types in draft, and if your team does not have at least one of these, it is not a good draft team. But that is just generally what my opinion is. That is the tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed. Sorry if I kind of went off on some rants there for a little while, but this is my official tier list on my opinions. I hope you all enjoy, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.